Okay, so the next topic is going to be looking at the potential impacts of hydrocarbon activities on wetlands. And the main subject, what I'm wanting to cover in this particular set of slides, is to look at what types of impacts do we tend to see when we have oil and gas operations in and near wetlands, and how do those actually affect the wetland. Later on, I'm going to talk about what are the contingency management of those particular impacts. And then we're going to talk about some case studies about processes that happened well, processes that didn't happen so well. And ultimately, we'll talk about restoration and mitigation activities. So first of all, we'll talk about the impacts. So in general, one of the things that I do at ERM for lots of my clients is we do large-scale impact analysis studies for large capital projects prior to them starting up. And part of the impact analysis and impact assessment process is to identify and categorize the impacts of a project. It's really important to know that you'll never, ever do a project in an area that has had no development where there will be no impact. There will always be an impact. It's how you regulate and manage those impacts that make the impacts minimal or make the impacts unmanageable and too much. So understanding first what those impacts are and what kind of impacts they are is the first step in the process. And so all impacts can really be divided into two categories. We look at direct impacts and indirect impacts. And essentially for wetland processes, the direct impacts are those impacts that occur within the boundary of the wetland and that will affect the wetland function. So if I'm going to do a project and I'm in the wetland, what are the impacts that are going to directly affect that wetland? That I'm going to build a road, I'm going to build a well pad, I'm going to do something that's going to affect the wetland right in the footprint of the project. Indirect impacts, direct impacts are very easy to identify, and they're very easy to put your arms around and say, I know what they are. Because I know what the project is, I can have the engineers design the project, and I know pretty much from the engineering design and the project layout exactly what those direct impacts are going to be. The indirect impacts are all those other impacts that occur outside of the boundary of the project that influence and affect the wetland function and the wetland services from in the wetlands. So things that happen upstream, things that happen downstream, things that affect the wetland that aren't necessarily directly from the project are all those indirect impacts. The combination of the direct impacts and the indirect impacts results in the overall cumulative impact for the project within the context of an impact analysis study. So let's talk about direct impacts first. I like those because, like I said, they're easy. Okay, so some of the direct impacts that we would see for a exploration and production activity in a wetland, the primary one is the physical impact. There's going to be a physical land impact to the process of the development. There's going to be some level of removal of the wetland habitat through the developmental activities itself. The building of the roads to get into that, the building of the well pads. This is a photograph. This is actually a photograph from North Dakota, far away from any kind of a tropical wetland, for a gas well. But you can see the extent of what an exploration well pad looks like. It's not just where the drill rig is. It's all the area and all the equipment that goes down to it. There's roads that lead in and out of it. There's the actual drilling infrastructure that's developed. There's the pits for the drilling muds. In North Dakota, where this picture was shot, the drilling muds are allowed to be put into pits. In many, many states in the United States, they're not allowed to put them into pits. They have to put them into tanks and containerize them. That relieves some level of direct impact of loss of the drilling muds, but in North Dakota, they leave that open. for that. There's oil water separators that go in to separate the hydrocarbons from the drilling muds and also anything produced water that comes out. There's pipelines that are laid. There's facilities that are developed for housing. There's coastal facilities that need to be developed for large-scale processes. So you have to have ports. You have to be able to get the product out. If you're going to pipeline it, you're going to have to pipeline it to somewhere. Either pipeline it directly to a refinery, or you're going to pipeline it to a port that's going to be able to be a transportation terminal to export. The transportation pathway that you're going to take to get the product and the equipment in and out, is that going to be on road? Is that going to be via water? It depends on the project, but those are all physical direct impacts that the project may have. Physical impacts on the water is important. Remember, we talked about the ecosystem services for the amount of water and the water flow and why that's important for wetlands. So any loss or change in the hydrogeology around the wetland is vitally important to the function of that wetland, and being able to mitigate and manage that is important of the upfront part of the project. When you remove particular channels, or you channelize parts of the wetland, you move water through the wetland faster, as we said before. So when you move water through these large-scale channels, engineered channels, you're going to change the way the water is distributed. When you build a levee along an engineered channel, you stop the water from going out of the wetland, out of the channel and into the wetland. These wetlands tend to dry up, very similar to the picture that you saw of that road that cut off the wetland, and you had one side of the wetland where there was water and one side of the wetland where it was now becoming a meadow. If you remove channels, classic Louisiana management of wetlands was cutting channels in some places and filling channels in other places to help manage where the water went. In the early 1900s, they didn't care so much about the wetland. They cared more about where the water went. And so they channelized a lot of the wetlands, and what a lot of the restoration activities that we do today are to replace and re-channelize try to get the water back into natural channels within the wetlands and to fill particular areas. When you channelize something, you redistribute not only the water, but you also redistribute the sediment, where the sediment goes. So you have increased sedimentation in some places. You have increased erosion in other places. And those two things vastly can change the dynamics and the processes that take place within a wetland. If you restrict the flow, you saw that was a great photograph before, where you restricted the flow by building a road across it. The downstream portion of that is gone. There's no more water flow through that. Even if you try to culvert that with an underwater tunnel or underground tunnel to let the water move through, there's problems with siltation on that. There's great ways to mitigate that. It just has to be done very good up front in the planning process. You can also lose access. If, for example, I had a population that was over here and they normally hunted or fished over here, and now I'm going to build a channel across it. If there's no way for them to get across, we've lost access. That's a loss of a cultural service. That's a loss of a provisioning service in the ecosystem world. One of the other areas that we see a lot in oil and gas exploration processes, particularly in the exploration piece, is the seismic surveys that take place when they're looking for the reserves. In general, the seismic issues and impacts, the direct impacts from the seismic issues are more intense if it's done offshore and it's in the water than it's done if it's on land. But seismic issues are still something that we need to look at in our impact analysis. And the noise also from the operations. If you're going to have operations that are running 24 hours a day in an area that has generally not been inhabited before, those noise issues can affect the wildlife. So you need to know what the noise issues are related to. Aside from the physical impacts of what can take place in the wetland, direct impacts from chemical exposure is probably the most detrimental. Direct exposure to hydrocarbons, either through the waste pits from the drilling muds or the water pits, spills related to the drilling operation, either the product spill, whether that's oil or condensate or gas, the produced water, that formation water that's brought up with the oil from the geology, the drilling muds and the fluid. This is a photograph of again, another drilling mud pond. And the production chemicals. A lot of the oil and gas operations will require a lot of chemicals to be able to actually drill through there. You have to have corrosion inhibitors. You have to have lubricants. All of that. There's potential in all of those opportunities for there to be spills. So good spill management and mitigation during the process and the upfront planning of a project will help remove those. This particular photograph shows a drilling mud pit. And you can see that the pit is not only placed in an area, but it's lined. It's lined with an impervious liner, because we don't want any of that stuff to get out into the groundwater. So the good management of being able to how you're going to handle that. And again, in certain situations, that material is not placed in a pit, it's placed in a tank. And those tanks regulate the water and dewatering of the material inside. There's a variety of exposure points for direct chemical exposure. You can have exposure points through the water, so chemicals that are found and released into the water, into the sediments. Sediments are interesting because everything that happens above a sediment in the water body ultimately goes into the sediment. So you can have very low levels of contamination in water, but high levels of contamination in the sediment because the sediment acts essentially as a long-term integrator of what's going on over the top of it. So all of those chemicals eventually find their way into the sediment, and being able to manage and mitigate sediment contamination is a big deal. And then also from all oil and gas operations, whether it's exploration, production, or refining or everything, there's air impacts. And again, there's ways to mitigate those, but there are impacts, direct impacts that we need to think about. There's direct impacts to biology. The wetland plants themselves. Most wetland plants are fairly resilient to hydrocarbon exposure. That's because, remember, as wetlands evolved, many of these plants evolved natural abilities to handle contaminant load. It's part of what makes a wetland filter, that biological kidney of the world. So a lot of those plants can handle fairly high levels of contamination and not be destroyed, like you might see in a terrestrial environment. The uptake of oil in wetland plants, the actual uptake is fairly slow. It's not like agricultural plants like maize, where you get vast uptake very fast into these plants because they're transpiring lots and lots of water. Wetland plants don't take up hydrocarbons very fast, but when they do, they tend to metabolize them, particularly in their root structure. And then many chemicals are sequestered in the plant tissue itself. That's part of that filtration. It grabs those chemicals and it binds them into the plant tissues themselves, particularly metals. And the toxicity, the general toxicity that we tend to see comes from a chronic exposure. And toxicity can really be broken down into two time scales. We talk about acute toxicity, and we talk about chronic toxicity. And acute toxicity is really what happens over sort of the course of days to weeks to months of exposure versus chronic exposure, which takes place over generational time or annual time. So long-term exposure versus short-term exposure. And it's that long-term exposure that tends to be more detrimental than short-term exposures in wetlands. The plankton and the algae in the water, those one-celled organisms, you can imagine that a one-celled organism is more susceptible to contaminant exposure than a big plant that's woody, that's got cellulose in its cell structure, that's a little more structured. So algae and plant are much more sensitive. They're much sensitive on the acute level. It doesn't take a lot of metals to kill algae. It doesn't take a lot to destroy phytoplankton populations. So understanding in your baseline studies of what the population looks like, what kind of organisms you have out there is really important, because needing to know what the level of contamination might be, particularly for a spill or something, and how quickly you're going to be able to respond. There's a very large body of toxicology literature and research that's been done on the exposure of hydrocarbons to organisms, both from the acute and the chronic exposure level. From a land animal standpoint, most land animals, birds, as well as mammals and reptiles, are less susceptible at the adult level than they are at the juvenile and the young level. That's partly because juveniles are growing faster. They also don't have as well-developed immunity systems, and they don't have as well-developed structures, particularly like mammals. They don't have a very well-developed liver yet, so they can't handle the contaminant load that adults tend to be able to have. Adult animals are also very difficult to work with in the laboratory from a toxicology standpoint, and juveniles are much easier to deal with, so there's a lot more literature on younger stages once the toxicology world started to focus more on juvenile stages of animals. For mammals particularly, their direct exposure is mostly through contact with the skin and fur. Animals, they tend to get hydrocarbons on them, lick the fur, and by licking the fur, they tend to get, that's their exposure point. And then bioaccumulative compounds are exposed to young through milk. So we see things like DDT, we see things like some hydrocarbons that you can see in milk, in mercury particularly, and things like that, that will come in through the milk for mammals. Birds, the acute exposure to adults is also something that's important. Birds particularly spend a lot of their life preening their feathers. Similar to mammals that would lick the fur, a bird preens its feathers all the time, particularly a water bird, because it's trying to maintain that level of waterproofness within its feathers. So that level of acute exposure, when they get exposed to, say, a spill, that's their route to exposure, and that will cause damage to those kind of organisms much faster than a long-term chronic exposure. When a female that's been exposed and may say it has oil on its feathers sits on the eggs, that exposure is transferred from the eggs across the membrane of the egg into the juvenile in the egg itself. So maintaining protection around nesting bird populations is very, very important. The same thing, exactly the same thing for turtles. So we spend a lot of time, one of my other hats that I wear is oil spill response specialist. And one of the areas that we try to protect first and foremost is nesting bird habitat and turtle nesting habitats because they come in so quickly. In Louisiana, we also have to protect alligators. You have alligators and crocodiles and caimans along here. They have the same kind of situation. They lay eggs, and they're exposed in that way. Also, contaminated nesting materials is another transfer point from adult to juvenile. From an aquatic animal standpoint, fish are probably the most susceptible to aquatic exposure. They live in the water. They breathe in the water. They're constantly exposed, both on a chronic and an acute standpoint. We see the effects, similar to the land mammals, we see the effects the highest on the eggs and the larval species of the fish. Reptiles, the toxicity data on reptiles is actually fairly limited. But again, crocodiles and alligator species, the exposure to the eggs, these organisms nest and lay eggs in the banks of the lakes and the channels and the rivers. So there's exposure points along those parts. Amphibians, the frogs and salamanders are also really highly susceptible through their exposure through the skin. They tend to have very thin skin, and transfer goes across their skin very, very fast. what we don't have is a lot of toxicology data on a wide variety of amphibians. We have some very good toxicology data on some 10 or 20 species of amphibians. But what we have seen is that the tox data don't really show differences that wide from species to species. So that's one of the organism types that's actually fairly easy to extrapolate from one species to another for toxicity data. So after the direct impacts, like I said, those are the easy ones. You can pretty much look at the data, look at the study plan, and identify from your baseline studies what the level of direct impacts are going to be. Indirect impacts are a little bit more because you have to start looking outside of the footprint of the project and see what else is it going to do. Is there going to be a downstream effect on a wetland from a project? Is there going to be an effect on a wetland from, say, an offshore operation that takes place? So indirect impacts have a much wider scale than the direct impacts have. We have, again, you can categorize them into the same general categories. The physical types of indirect impacts, erosion caused by outside activities. If I'm building a road upstream, I may affect the downstream erosional capability and processes that take place within a wetland. So I need to know what's going on in other areas and what other projects are going on. Changes in one area can have a far-reaching area into a different side. Erosion, again, is a big problem. Land availability is another one. Oftentimes, you need to generate a land mass to build the drill pad on. So you need to fill particular areas. You might need to move an area outside that you're going to keep. Part of your project is going to affect downstream land availability outside of the footprint of where your particular project takes place. You may have downstream effects on water quality and in aquatic systems from the operation that you have within your wetland, so that you're indirectly affecting another area by the operations that you're doing in one place. So if I'm drilling over here, I might actually be affecting a wetland over here. It's not just the physical impact and the direct impact of where I'm at that's important. Downstream availability of water on beaches and even into the aquatic and marine environment is important to understand what the dynamics of the water flow and the dynamics of the potential contaminant flow might be, and sediment transport as well. Noise generated in one area can go a long way in different areas. So you might have disruption on migratory corridors. So you might have an indirect impact of noise from this particular area affecting bird population in a different area. Noise impacts are generally temporary. Very seldom do we see acute, lethal issues related to noise. They tend to be only when the noise is happening, and it tends to be just a behavioral effect. But it can affect things downstream and a long way away, depending on where you're at, particularly if that noise is taking place in the water. Sound levels propagate through the water much farther and faster than they do through the air. Indirect impacts of chemicals, chemical impacts is probably the biggest thing to deal with. Spills and discharges. A spill in one particular area can have a downstream effect on vast ecosystems and down the coast. Those are often felt in low-level and chronic types of exposures. Chemicals can impact groundwater if they're not done right. That groundwater pit, wastewater pit that you saw, if that was unlined, the water that is in that pit could get into the groundwater. So you can have indirect effects with downstream groundwater areas, particularly if you don't manage those particular things right, like the waste pits and the water containment. Chemicals in the water can affect the sustainability of the water system. So we've seen in a lot of places in the United States where we have groundwater contamination from an operation that lasts for a long time after that operation is gone because the contaminants are in the groundwater and they don't tend to move very fast in the groundwater. And once they're in the groundwater, they're very difficult to remove. So trying to keep them out of the groundwater from the beginning of the project is the best way to go. Chemicals in the air can have far-reaching impacts. We see effects in San Francisco. There's 3 different oil refineries in San Francisco area that all generate some level of airborne dioxin. And dioxin's an organic chemical that is cancer-causing, and it can be lethal at certain concentrations. We see dioxin in sediments in San Francisco Bay from airborne deposition. So it's released from the refineries, it travels towards San Francisco Bay, and it's deposited on the bay surface, and it gets into the sediment. That's, again, the sediment's that long-term integrator, so we can find it in the sediments in San Francisco Bay. We've been able actually to fingerprint it and trace it back to some of the refineries, and then change the way the refineries handle the air stacks and how the air is released at the refineries to remove those dioxin chemicals. So really knowing what kind of chemicals are going to be released, even from airborne operations, is important. Indirect biological impacts are really things like bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is when you have a contaminant that builds up in the tissues of an organism. So if I eat something and it's got a contaminant in it, I'm going to get that contaminant in my tissues. I'm going to accumulate it in my tissues. Biomagnification is if a bunch of organisms have that level of contamination in it, and it transfers across trophic levels. So if something that small fish has mercury in it, the big fish eats the small fish, the big fish will have more mercury in their tissue than the small fish. It magnifies the concentration across the trophic level. It's not just the accumulation in the one organism, it actually can magnify. Not every chemical can do that because of the different kinds of qualities of the chemicals, but things like DDT and mercury, those can magnify. So bioaccumulation can take place over long periods of time in tissues. It can occur in both plants and animals. Organics and metals can bioaccumulate. Not all of them do. You have to know which of the chemicals you might be exposed to and know what the properties of those are. And you can then identify from a risk standpoint what the level of bioaccumulation and biomagnification might be. They often have cancer-causing or mutagenic effects on the organism where they're bioaccumulating. Biomagnification is that one that builds up across the food webs. That generally, you end up with higher concentrations of those chemicals in the higher level predators. So protecting eagles or ospreys or birds that eat fish in the wetland, they might not live in the wetland, but if they feed in the wetland, you've got to protect them because you might have a bioaccumulative or biomagnification potential of reaching those organisms. Again, proper management of the operation can alleviate a lot of these kinds of risks. Exposure through uptake of the food and the water. If you have contaminants in the food and in the water, you can get direct uptake from that, and you can get indirect uptake as well. It's well documented in the scientific literature how well these chemicals transfer through water systems, and it's often very low-level chronic exposures that are the most problematic. So if you're discharging a very low level of a concentration into a water body, the acute toxicity of that concentration that you're releasing might not be very harmful, but that level of contamination for a very long period of time can be harmful. So knowing what the chemicals are and what the properties that they're likely to be exposed to in that environment will help you ameliorate those risks and handle those risks through proper management and mitigation. So generally, in conclusion, for the direct and indirect impacts, hydrocarbon exposure through oil and gas operations in wetlands can take place through both indirect and direct exposure pathways. You can have physical, chemical, and biological effects can be expected from releases. Wetland plants are often more resilient to direct exposure and may act as that biological filter to some of those exposure points. The effects are often, for all organisms, are often more evident in the juveniles and the eggs than we see. And the effects of any operation can be effectively mitigated and managed for wetland exposures through mitigation and monitoring activities. And that's going to be the subject of the next talk after lunch, right? Lunch next? Okay. Yeah, so then after that, we're going to talk about mitigation and monitoring, and then we're going to talk about some case studies and some contingency management. And now I'm done.